Okay, that's up and running. Go back to here. Full screen. Okay. Everyone hear me okay? Okay, so it's good to see so many people coming back the second time, because you never quite know how these types of discussions are going to impact different people. So last week, we took a look at God in God's self, that is to say God's own essence, and how that then plays out into our understanding of creation. And I imagine that there were some ideas, some of our discussion that may have been new. It may have upended some of the things you had thought. It may have upended things you were glad to get rid of. But this week we're going to begin something that is more challenging, and the promise is that next week is going to be even more so. But this week we're going to be looking at the topic of Revelation. And Revelation is where many people begin to come to grips with their faith, with God, or where they tend to lose their grip with their faith and with God. Many people comfortably settle into an understanding of Revelation that works for them, but they're really not willing to look any deeper into it for fear they may find something that doesn't work and then they're going to be unhappy. On the other hand, many people plow into the notion of Revelation just deep enough to realize that there are some big question marks and then turn away from faith altogether. So this is where we take a big dive. So let's see how we do. Let's hope that this is set up correctly. Yes, okay. So in this section on Revelation, we're going to be covering 4 different sections. We're going to be covering problems with the, in quotes, literal model. Now I say in quotes, literal model because this is the model that many people assume is how the Torah itself thinks of its own revelation, of how traditional-minded people think of Revelation. And therefore this is sort of the litmus test that many people have for, if you don't believe in this, then you don't really believe it. And we are going to discuss some of the problems with that vision of Revelation. We're also going to look then at the alternative mode, of what Revelation actually does mean, both by our tradition, as well as what it can mean for us. We're going to see how, especially in Judaism, but really for any faith, Revelation and reason need to work together. They are not at odds. And then finally, we're going to try and put all together and figure out what Revelation means at all. Why is it important that we actually have a clearer and deeper understanding of Revelation? So everyone has the agenda down? Okay. God's existence reveals itself. Just like with last week, if you didn't remember anything else except a little phrase, this week, here's your phrase. God's existence reveals itself. Revelation is happening as an ongoing byproduct, if you will, although that's really not quite fair, but it's happening as an ongoing result of God's very existence. Not what most people are used to, not what the picture books show. When you think of the literal definition of Revelation, you think of the fundamentalist definition, you think of the faithful view of Revelation, what most people think of is something along these lines. God really liked some people, so he talked to them. Right? You can see there's God, there's Moses, and God is dictating. God is telling him exactly what to write, what it means, and all that good stuff. Which those people God chose to talk to wrote down what God said. And that is often portrayed as being the true test of what Revelation is. If you believe that, you're good. If you don't believe that, you're in trouble. And the problem is, believing that puts you in trouble as well. Does that mean that God, when he spoke to these people, made sound waves that then entered their ears? Does that mean someone else, if they were standing by when Moses was talking with God at the burning bush, would have been able to eavesdrop on that private conversation? Is God speaking in a manner that is akin to our speaking? He's talking. then why did the rest of the Israelites freak out when it happened? Remember the incident that happened at Mount Sinai? When there is the light, the thunder, and the smoking mountain, and God begins to proclaim what we call the Ten Commandments, the Aseret HaDibrot, and all the Israelites go, "Gah!" That's more or less a quote. "Moses, you go, we'll stay here." Well, if God's just talking, no matter how booming of a voice the Svi Mill has, why would they freak out? Did God just need to turn his mic down? I mean, if it's just talking, if Revelation is just a verbal communication of God's words, why should there have been that reaction? And the one that's more troubling, more problematic from this literal mode is really why, if that's all that happens, God doesn't just talk to everyone, right? Why isn't God just constantly having chats with everyone in the world to tell them what's what and that he exists? And therefore we get rid of this whole people who don't believe in God, people who think that, God doesn't really exist. We can take care of that like that. All we need is God to talk to everyone the way he talked to the chosen few. It seemed to imply a course of action for God to take. But the literal model doesn't really answer these questions, so we're going to have to do something else. The voice emanated and reached Moses' ears, but the rest of Israel did not hear it. In the very beginning of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, our sages in Sifra, that's one of our earliest collections of Midrashim, say, why is it Vayikra that God called to Moses? What does that really mean? Well, it means that the voice emanated and it reached Moses' ears, but it didn't reach anyone else's ear. But how does sound stop? I didn't even hear an acoustic engineer. Right? If there is no barrier, what happens to sound waves? What happens to any wave? It just keeps going until its energy is dissipated. So a sound wave between you and the person sitting behind you, it's going to reach them if it reaches you. It may not reach someone in the next building because you've got walls and barriers, but it's definitely going to reach more people. And the sages say it didn't reach everyone else, even though it was, in quote, loud and clear for Moses. Now one might think then that was because the voice was too soft. Maybe God was whispering from between the wings of the angels on the top of the Ark of the Covenant, and only Moses could hear it because he leaned in, and that's why no one else in the entire camp of the Israelites could hear it. No, it's not because it was too soft. We know from Psalm 29, which we recite every single Friday night, that the voice of the Lord is in strength, makoach, and the voice of the Lord is in beauty. The voice of the Lord breaks cedars, right? That's not a quiet voice. That's not a gentle voice. That's the kind of voice that shakes the world. So if the voice was reaching Moses, why didn't it reach the rest? Because the voice stopped. We're going to figure out what that means. I mentioned about the reaction of the Israelites, in case you need a little refresher. In the book of Exodus, when it first is described, it says, and all the people perceived the thunderings and the lightnings and the voice of the shofar and the mountain smoking, and when the people saw it, they trembled and stood far away. What good is standing far away from the mountain? What, God can't talk to you there? He could only talk to you if you were close to the mountain? Why would they retreat if the literal model is true? Because the literal model would seem to imply that God can talk to you anywhere you are. The Lord talked with you, Moses recounts in Deuteronomy, face to face on the mountains in the midst of the fire. I stood between you and the Lord, or between the Lord and you at that time, to declare to you the word of the Lord, for you were afraid because of the fire, and you did not go up the mountain. So again, there seems to be something among the people that prevented them from joining Moses in the experience of revelation to the same degree. And we need to figure out what that is. And the true reality and essence of prophecy, which is what Revelation is really talking about, is an overflowing overflow, or an overflowing from God. This is Rambam in the Guide for the Perplexed, about 1,000 years ago. The true reality and essence of prophecy is an overflowing from God. Get a picture in mind of what that might look like. What it means is that God is always broadcasting to everyone. Only some, however, are prepared to tune in. Think of the difference between me sending you a letter. All right, Nikki, I send you a letter. It's addressed to you. It goes to you for your eyes only. This letter will self-destruct in 60 seconds. All right, that's one form of communication. Think, on the other hand, of someone grabbing the mic at a radio station and saying, now hear this, and broadcast it. Do they get to choose who listens? No. So how do we know, who decides who hears the broadcast and who doesn't? If I'm shooting it out from a radio tower, who? You need a receiver. You need a receiver. You need the listener. You need someone to hear it. It's not that God is picking the winners and losers of Revelation, not that God is choosing who will hear and who will not. That God exists, and the nature of God's existence and the implication of that nature for our world, which is cumulatively what we call revelation, is constantly flowing out of God. Rambam's words, our modern analogy is it's constantly being beamed out as a radio signal. Not a literal radio signal. Please don't go looking for God on the radio. You will be very disappointed. But that it is constantly being broadcast. What is important is being able to tune in. So let's talk about how that really works, right? How does revelation actually work then? If the idea is that God is not saying, you I'm talking to and you I'm not, but instead God is saying, I am sending this out constantly, what does that mean for our understanding of revelation really? Well, the simple model is broken and offensive, right? So the alternative model is based on our discussion of creation. God's existence is reflected universally in the world, but, and this is an enormous but, it is impossible for us to easily or perfectly grasp it. Again, go back to our radio analogy. You have a receiver, but this is the Radio Shack kit. If you still remember Radio Shack, may it rest in peace. You have the Radio Shack kit that you put together, and maybe your kit you didn't quite put together so well, and maybe you bought the cheaper kit. The signal you hear is going to be a little, it's going to be a little staticky. Yes? Right? That is our imperfection of grasping what God is transmitting. And there's another part that makes it a little hard. Right? The universe was designed with the aim of letting us know God. I think for a second about that as a building from what we talked about last week. Right? The universe itself is a reflection of God. Part of that reflection was to make it knowable to the spiritual creatures of the universe, us, that would be made in such a way that we could, within the capacity of our material human existence, know God. But that means that every atom, every law of nature, every action, every motion, everything in the entire universe is screaming at us about God. And that makes things harder rather than easier. It's kind of like being hit with a fire hose, right? All of reality is spraying us in the face with God. And when you finally begin to tune it in, if you're not perfectly tuned, you get that on your radio set. And what do when you suddenly hear that giant burst of static on the radio? You turn it down. You turn it off. You go, whoa, I must have crossed the wires here somewhere. It's not working right. Rather than sorting through the static to figure out what it's trying to say. The Israelites were hit in the face with the fire hose of God. Pardon the metaphor. When they were at Sinai, there was a particular moment in time that had been designed from the beginning when an entire group of people would be able to experience God more powerfully than any other group before or since would in a singular moment ever experience God. And for the vast majority of them, it was a fire hose experience. They couldn't pull out individual drops. They couldn't understand individual streams of what God was infusing into their life. It was overwhelming. It was having the headset on and the massive burst of static, and all you want to do is yank off the headset rather than trying to fine-tune to hear the signal that's inside what you are perceiving as static. Every prophet, every sage, and every individual of lesser capacity, that means the rest of us, has tapped into this same reservoir. We all drink from the same well. But one of the biggest confusions about the notion of revelation is particularism. That somehow God is sending a letter to you, and sending a letter to you, and sending a letter to you, and they're different letters. And although there is certainly a particularism or uniqueness that is important in the relationship between each of us and God, and each prophet and God, and each of the sages and God, all the letters that were sent were the same. They came from the same source. They came from the same reservoir. You would no more say that God revealed differently to one person or another than you would say that the water that came out of my pipe that came from the same reservoir as the water that came from your pipe is different. It's water from the same source. It has the same origin, it has the same characteristics, and it has the same effect when imbibed. No one's going to ask a question about that? If it all comes from the same source, it all has the same effect, if it's all the same origin, then why does it sound so different in the voice of one prophet or another? Well, why should the prophets sound so unique and individual? When I read Amos, it's very different than reading Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel, which is something that can really make your head hurt. It's all from the same source. Shouldn't it all come like Moses, crystal clear and pure, exactly all in the same form? Why would we even need additional statements if it's all from the same source? Well, because each one of us grabs at it from a different point and takes it in our own application of the moment. Let me give you an example. One of the questions that came up at the end of last week's session was, if Moses was so special, if the Torah was so special, what about the people who preceded him? And of course, Abraham is one of the most famous and special of all those people. And Rabbi Yitzchak taught, how do we understand Abraham's journey? To what may it be compared? To a man who was traveling from place to place when he saw a palace in flames. Right, so imagine the scene, you're walking down the road, you look up on the hill, and there is a beautiful palace, and it's burning. And he says to himself, is it possible that the palace has no owner? Did the palace grow out of the ground? Are palaces often just left abandoned and no one owns them? If there is a palace, someone owns it. The owner of the palace looked out and said, I am the owner of the palace. Because the person stopped and looked to ask, then the owner of the palace could look out and respond. And so Abraham, our father, said, is it possible that the world lacks a ruler? Notice the parallel here. The world is the palace. What state is the world in? On fire. The world is burning. Abraham looked at his world and saw it burning. And he recognized at once that there must be a creator, and at once that the world was burning. And he demanded to know, where is the owner? And the owner said, I'm right here. Have been the whole time. But thank you for stopping and asking. For many people, the beginning of an experience of God and of a revelation of God's truth is from their recognition of the injustice and the tragedy of the world, which makes them stop and notice the fire, which allows them to notice the palace, which allows them to notice the palace owner. When Abraham asked, God looked out and said, I am the ruler, the sovereign of the universe. Or perhaps you prefer a different Abraham story. After Abraham was weaned, he began to muse and started to ponder by day and by night, and would question how it was possible for the earth to continue to revolve without a God. As we all do, right? When the moment we're weaned, we wax philosophical, we wonder about the nature of our world and our place in it. Well, maybe not all of us do. Maybe there was something special about Abraham, but he did. And he had no mentor, nor did anyone reveal anything to him. That is to say, no one told him truth. He had to work this out for himself, but he was immersed in Ur Kasdim among foolish idolaters. His father and mother and all the people served idols, and he would serve with them, while his heart pondered and mused. So here is this young boy. Everything seems wrong and foolish, but it's what they do. And he's wondering, this doesn't seem right. Until he understood the path of truth and realized the line of justice by virtue of his own correct reasoning. Then he came to understand that there was only one God, and that he was the guide of the celestial wheel. He created everything, and there is no God among all of creation other than him. Most of us can't do that on our own. Right? Most of us haven't been doing philosophical speculation from the moment we stopped suffering. Abraham did. He was a unique person. But through his line of careful and correct reasoning and understanding what justice must be, he came to the correct conclusion. And when he did, God reciprocated and said, Lech lecha. Now that I have seen that you have recognized me, now you can hear me. Now you will hear me telling you, go. Go to this new land. God had been saying that since the beginning of time. But no one like Abraham had tuned in like Abraham. How are we doing so far? Okay? Okay. So what the prophets were destined to prophesy, say our sages, they received from Mount Sinai. And Moses spoke all the words of the other prophets as well as his own. This is one of those great head scratchers in the Midrash. So wait a minute. We have hundreds of prophets later, although not all of their works have been preserved, but we know that there were hundreds of prophets later after the time of Moses. And you're telling me that everything they were going to say, all of the prophecies they were going to reveal, their part of Revelation, as it were, that was already done in Mount Sinai. And that Moses spoke all the words of the other prophets as well as his own? Would have taken a long time. How could Moses have duplicated the work of all the other prophets? What do we mean by Moses duplicating the work of all the other prophets? Does that mean the other prophets were just copying him? No. What it means is that all of them were copying from the same source. As all the prophets are tapping into the same source, Moses, who saw the source most clearly, knows what they know better than they do. Right? Imagine everybody in this room is taking notes. I mean, that's not a requirement, it's okay. Right? Imagine everybody in this room is taking notes, but some of us have better eyesight than others, some of us are quicker writers than others, some of us have better handwriting than others, some of us are sitting closer to the front of the room, some of us are sitting way at the back. Some people are busy in the kitchen, and they just pop out and take notes every now and then. The notes of Moses, that grade A, front row, gifted student right up there with the perfect penmanship and attention to detail, his notes will include everything that was taken by everyone else in the room. His notes are perfect. Everyone else's notes are varying degrees of imperfect. It's not that he was copying off of theirs, it's not that they shared notes, it's that they were all looking at the same presentation and all taking the same notes. So you should not expect to find anything in their notes that wasn't in his. And in fact, his version is better. As our sages said, what was the difference between Moses and the other prophets? Right? Because as we just pointed out, it wasn't that they were listening to a different source. It wasn't that God liked Moses better than he liked the other prophets. It was that the others looked through 9 lenses, but Moses looked through just one. The others looked through a cloudy lens, but Moses looked through one that was clear. Where are they all looking? The same place. So what's the difference? The viewer. Exactly right. Thank you for piping up. Everyone else is way too shy. Right? They're all looking the same direction. They're all looking at the same God. And please, looking is a metaphor. The difference isn't what God does for them. The difference is what they end up doing with what they can receive. of what piece of the image of God they are able to pull from this experience. And for Moses, it's like somebody looking at something through one lens, and for the rest of the prophets, let alone us, it's like looking at the same thing but through 9 stacked lenses. And remember, we're not talking about advanced optics in the ancient world. You stack lenses, you're not getting a clearer view. It means it's getting cloudier and cloudier and cloudier. And so too, if your lens is already cloudy, it gets even worse, whereas Moses' lens was clear. But note, by the way, the one subtle, almost subversive implication of this, Moses too looked through a lens. Moses' understanding is as perfect as a human's understanding can be, but don't think that even Moses understood God perfectly. He understood God as perfectly as a human can, but that doesn't mean he understood God. Our tradition from the Torah on through our sages is very clear that as far as Moses was able to go above and beyond everyone else, he was never able to reach the infinity of God. His lack, that is to say, Moses' lack of poetic flourish, is evidence of his clarity. A Rorschach test can be anything. Right? What do you see in that picture? I'm sure if I asked the whole room of everyone to write down, what's that? Don't ask. Yeah, don't ask.
Moses lecturing to the Jews.
What's that?
Moses speaking to the
It's
Jews.
Moses speaking to the Jews, clearly. I mean, look, you can see there he's standing, his arms are up, right? It's Moses lecturing, or it's a wolf, or it's a butterfly. I was at the butterfly garden this morning, or it's whatever you are bringing into this, right? If that's what you see, you are going to come up with a very colorful expression as you try to capture it. But if you saw a circle, if it wasn't cloudy, if it wasn't blotchy, if it wasn't, light and dark patches, but just a nice crisp circle, if I asked everyone in this room, what do you see? You'd say, a circle. This is what the prophet saw, and Moses, looking at the same source, saw a circle. So when the prophets describe a throne, it's because their Rorschach test of seeing God was cloudy enough that they were able to construct the image of a throne. Whereas when Moses saw God, he doesn't talk about thrones. He just says, God. And the metaphor that's used by our tradition over and over for that is he saw God face to face. Again, anthropomorphisms, it's speaking in the language of man. The idiom of seeing something face to face means you see it clearly without shadow or blotch or any confusion. That's why Moses is so special. When the mind grasps the idea of God and the totality of God's wisdom as represented in God's ways in creation, right? This is the beginning of what revelation means. When you begin to tune in, when your mind begins to grasp God, and you begin to understand God because of God's way and because of creation, I'm sorry, our little brains struggle to put it in terms that a conscious mind can articulate. You have the experience, you have the exposure, you've tuned it in, and now you've got the job of trying to make some sense of it that can fit inside your mind in some fashion. So what do? Images drawn from memory coalesce in the mind to give shape and form to these thoughts. So why is God constantly referred to in kingly metaphor throughout the prophets? Is it because God is actually sitting with a crown on his head and on a giant throne? No, it's because the experience for the prophets who lived 3,000 years ago, the only thing that they could begin to use as an image from their experience to possibly hint at the experience of God was the experience that a commoner might have in the presence of a king. And so they use that metaphor, they use that image to try and somehow capture the majesty of God, because it was all they had. Nowadays, we might do something similar. We might say it was like being starstruck, being in the room with your favorite movie star, God forbid. Or being overcome because you've met some politician that you respect, if there is one. But the idea would be that how do you put into words that which is beyond words? And you would try to find some image, some idea that could give it shape, that could then be passed on to others. And why then is Moses so special? And what is it that we look for in prophets? Well, prophecy only rests upon the wise person who is distinguished by great wisdom and strong moral character. That you have to be wise and you have to have a strong moral foundation, because your passions can never overcome him or her. And yes, there are both men and female prophets mentioned within the Bible. And your rational faculty always has control of the impulses. And the person has to possess a broad and calm mind. Think back again to the Israelites and the fire hose image. Right? If you allow your passions to get the better of you, your fear, your anger, your desperate desires, then when you are bombarded by this experience of God, you will twist it, you will warp it to match those impulses and passions. If you don't have a calm, an open mind, you will force God into the pigeonholes you already have created to explain your life. And you will say, God supports whatever it is I already supported before I experienced God. And indeed, you will see people constantly shoehorning God into whatever agenda they may have. They get the idea first, and then they cram God into the tiny little space to make it fit. And it happens constantly because we all want to believe that God justifies our own opinions. True revelation says, no, I'm not asking that God justify my opinion. I'm asking to experience God and then try to make sense of it. And when I make sense of it, I will then have the tools with which to form opinions based upon revelation rather than based upon my own impulses, desires, fears, and other psychological trauma. All right, but again, we're seeing the pattern here. God is emanating into the world, simple and clear and overwhelming. We are limited by our own capacity to understand, to be clear, to not get overcome either by fear or distortion of what we are receiving. And then we translate that as best as we can into words that can convey the message that we have tuned into. But no matter how I convey it, no matter how I tune in, it doesn't change the message. And it certainly doesn't change the sender. And just because you're getting static on your radio doesn't mean the tower isn't broadcasting. And just because I get a little bit doesn't mean the tower is to blame. And just because it sounds a little bit like country western to me doesn't make it country western. That's your mind doing its best to understand what you're perceiving. And it's, trying to make sense. All right, questions before we move on? Okay. God's existence reveals itself. Again, that's our quote for the day. It's not that God is sending messages. It is God is sending the message constantly, uninterruptedly, unambiguously. If only we were God, it wouldn't be an issue. We would understand it perfectly. But we're not. Moses came the best and wrote down his experience. Other prophets came along and had similar experiences, but lacked the same capacity to either experience or to translate the experience intelligently to the rest of us, and they did their best. And together, all of that is what we call the official body of revelation, or what is known as canon. Or in the Jewish library, the book you're looking for is called the Tanakh, the Bible. Which most people usually, when they hear, think means reason is out the door. Right? As soon as you start talking about the Bible, most people think that reason has to be checked before you can have that conversation. Right? You're either rational or you're faithful. But you're not two simultaneously. Maybe you alternate. Mondays you're rational and Tuesdays you're faithful, but you certainly wouldn't try to do both at the same time. They're inherently incompatible. And this has been the great myth of the 20th and 21st century. The record of revelation, what we call the Bible, is a record as God wished it to be. The Torah we have is the Torah God used to create the world. Again, what we discussed last week. And so the Torah is an accurate record of the greatest experience of God that we have, the clearest record of what God is for our people. Right? The clearest tuning in and then transcribing that has ever occurred. But, the letters up there, the text does not speak for itself, and it relies on reason for us to understand and apply it to our lives. The Torah has no voice of its own. The Torah doesn't self-explain itself. There is no such thing as a self-explaining text. Not the Torah, not the textbook you had in your History 101 class in university, nothing. All texts demand that you somehow open it up and analyze it and comprehend it. And that is not an easy process. But more than that, just use it as an example. Imagine you've been given a perfect copy of every book ever published. Every book ever published throughout all of time, you now have a perfect copy. No errors, no typos, no blurry letters. Everything is perfect, no missing pages. But all those books are on microfilm. And someone hands you a giant warehouse full of microfilm and says, here is the collected printed works of the entire human race. If you look hard with your naked eye, maybe you can read a word or two, right? I mean, microfiche is tiny, but maybe you've got really good eyes, better than mine, and you can make out a word or two, but is that a one or an I? Right? I mean, I can barely tell if it's a one or an I here, and that's 30-point font, which is as big as my hand. We need tools and reason to be able to decipher a perfect copy. The record of revelation that we have is like microfilm. It is the condensed, the distilled version of our experience of God as revealed through Moses, and we need to undistill it. We need to unpack it. We need to zoom in to be able to use it. And that doesn't happen with a magnifying glass. That happens with the tool that makes you most human, known as your brain. Right? Remember, there were two gifts that were given to us that defined us as being human when we were in the Garden of Eden. Right? The first was the breath of life, the soul that God breathed into us. And the second? We ate something. Right? I said gifts because it defines us as being human. Right? All life has an animate spirit, or else it wouldn't be alive, it'd be a rock. The thing that makes us uniquely human, that distinguishes us from all other animate spirits, is the fact that we have a rational capacity to understand the world around us. And we use those two together through this nexus of Torah, through this nexus of our faith. Don't worry, we'll come back to this. So it says in Deuteronomy, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall appear before the priests or magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem. Sounds very nice, very reasonable, very rational. Why does it even make sense? If the application of revelation was self-evident, why is this law needed? Why should there be confusion? This was mentioned at the time of Moses, and we have multiple times in the Torah itself, where after revelation has happened, still people come to Moses with questions. If revelation and the record of it was self-evident and obviously clear to anyone who bothered to open up the book, you wouldn't need someone to adjudicate it. You wouldn't need to study and decipher what it really means. You would just open the book, read it from front to the end, and as long as you remembered it, you know what God wanted. And the Torah itself says that's not how it works. There is going to be stuff that's too hard for you to understand, even with the aid of revelation, let alone trying to be Abraham and crawling your way towards God on your own 2 feet, even with the gift of revelation, this greatest record of Moses, the clearest viewer of God ever, you are still going to have problems. And how do you fix the problem? We argue about it. You know the old joke, right? You have 2 Jews, you get 3 opinions. Right? That's not a joke, that is a theological proclamation. Right? That is not something we just laugh at. That is exactly how we are meant to live. That is our flint and our steel. Right? From Bava Metzia, Rabbi Yochanan said, when I stated a law, my study partner, Reish Lakish, used to raise 24 objections. Now think for a second. Rabbi Yochanan, one of the great scholars of his age, who can object to what he possibly says? Isn't he going to be a clear, wise student of revelation? What objections can possibly arise when such a man speaks? And yet his student, Reish Lakish, would raise 24 objections. And he would then have to provide 24 answers. And that led to a sharper understanding of the law. And the word law, of course, is Torah. Right? You need flint and you need steel to understand, to make the fire, to make the light. It's not just enough to have flint, and it's certainly not enough just to have steel. There has to be debate because the record of revelation is not self-explanatory. It's not like one of those tents that you can just throw on the ground and it'll set itself up, or those life rafts where you just pull the cord and it'll inflate automatically. You've got to take and go, okay, it says I have to put one pole into another pole. Chaim, which poles do you think we put together? Well, I think it would make sense if it was this pole. Well, I'm not sure about that. You know, the other pole might be better for... That is what we must do. Application of the law will not yield to miraculous proof, but must be accompanied by persuasive logic. Because you might think if revelation is so good and miracles are so handy, why not just use them to settle the debate? Right? If you get a question, flip a coin, and whichever way the coin comes up, that's what God wants. And by the way, that worked, in quotes, in many parts of the world for thousands of years. You had a difficult trial that you didn't know the answer to. What did you do? You went to the oracle. Right? You went to the magical source of information. You would have a trial by combat. What was a trial by combat? What was the premise of it? The premise was that God would strengthen the person who was right. And by whoever won, you must know then who God wanted to win. And you didn't have to worry about all that messy law stuff, all that messy who was actually right or wrong. Just like God decided by who can stick a sword and stop inside the other person first. 2,000 years ago, Judaism said, no, that is not what Torah says, and that is not how we are doing this. It's a wonderful story. I highly recommend you read the full version, but I had to fit this onto a slide. After witnessing many miracles in support of Rabbi Eliezer's position, including flying trees and water going backwards, a voice from heaven said that he was right. After all of this, Rabbi Yoshua stood up on his feet and said, Lo b'shamayim hi, which is a quote from the Torah, which means it is not in heaven. The Torah is not in heaven. And there in context it says, you should not say the Torah is in heaven and wonder who will go up to get it for us. It is near and it is in your mouth and in your heart to do. And Rabbi Yoshua argues with heaven itself and in the face of obvious miracles to say, that is not how it works since Torah was given. Since the moment the Torah was given, we do not accept miracles as proof. So Rabbi Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, from the Torah, for the Torah has already been given from Mount Sinai, so we do not pay attention to Bat Kol, which is a voice from heaven. Since you have already written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority you are to incline. Again, why would the Torah bother to tell us to follow the majority? Unless it knew that the only way we can understand the Torah is by debate and discussion and analysis. And even with debate, discussion, and analysis, there's still going to be some who hold position A and some who hold position B. And eventually we're going to have to make a choice of what we're going to do in our community. And you follow the majority.
And what's the relevance of the word incline?
What's relevant to the word incline is it's a decent translation of the word there in the Hebrew, but the idea is also that you are meant to incline after the majority when the rules have been followed, but you do not lead with the majority when the majority has perverted justice. Right, so there is an issue here of which way you are leaning. And you lean with the majority when the process works, when you have gone through the steps of analysis, debate, and discussion. If the majority are just moving like sheep, you don't let them sweep you away. And that wonderful word incline is what is hinting at that in the book of Exodus.
Is there any inference in that word that as the majority of the better view of the source over time, that the majority's position on a given situation will evolve?
All right, so context and time of application is going to be very, very important. But we'll get to there in just a second, right? Application of law. So we've just said we're not going to yield to miracles for the understanding of how to undo revelation. And the application of law will not yield to arguments solely by authority either, though we do expect our authorities to provide good explanations, right? Authorities are very worthwhile because they will usually understand the text of the revelation well, and they will usually be able to provide good explanations of the interpretation of the text. But you don't just say, well, he's an authority, I don't need an explanation. Rabbeinu Avraham, who is better known, unfortunately for him, as Rambam's son. It's like everybody, calls me Rambam's son, but he is a great scholar in his own right. Wrote a very famous piece called The Discourse of Rabbeinu Avraham, from which this comes. And again, highly recommend that you read this piece in its entirety. It's available online in translation. Let me know if you want to link it. But he argues, whoever propounds a certain theory or idea and expects the theory or idea to be accepted merely out of respect for the author, without proving its truth and reasonableness, pursues a wrong method prohibited by both the Torah and human intelligence. I wish that fit on a bumper sticker. Right? I don't care who's saying it. Well, that's not true. I do care, and I will appreciate it more from people who I have come to depend upon for good thinking. But even somebody who I have seen time and time again come to good conclusions and good analysis of Torah, and our understanding of Torah has increased because of their contributions, when they say something new, they have to prove it. They have to provide a marble. That's rather odd. Little marble rolling across the floor. They have to provide actual proof and support for the position that they've taken. If they say Torah means X, you don't just say, well, thank you, Rabbi. I guess that means Torah means X. You say, thank you, Rabbi. Why? What has led you to the conclusion that Torah means X when it said that? And chances are they'll be able to give you a very good explanation and answer. And you will grow from it, and they will grow by providing that explanation. And if you can provide objections, just like we discussed about Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, our flint and steel, then both you and the person making the statement will create new light by it. But if you think all we have to do is rely on authority, you are rejecting Torah itself. Not to mention rejecting the gift of human intelligence. And now we come to the question about context. Right? Application of the law also requires context and knowledge of the community and times. So remember how we had that whole discussion, seems like a long time ago, about Moses knowing everything that every other sage or prophet would ever say? Right? Because he was the guy sitting in the front of the room and was taking good notes and would understand it all, right? We all remember that? It was only half an hour ago. Well, there's a story in Menachot in the Talmud that maybe is going to throw a little bit of that on its head. When Moses went to heaven, that is to say, when he went up to heaven to get the Torah and bring it down to the world, metaphorically again, but bear with the language of humanity. He found God sitting and affixing crowns to the letters. If you've looked at a Sefer Torah, if you've looked at the Torah scroll, you'll notice that at the top of many of the letters, there are little filigree crowns, no real better words, that are sitting on the top of certain letters. And he said, Master of the universe, who detains your hand? Who makes you do this? Is someone demanding better calligraphy of the creator of the world, that the Torah is not done until there are little bits on the top of these letters? Did it get sent back from the consumer to the printing house saying, I want it in fancier font? Well, who's making God have to do all of this extra work? Again, we're dealing with metaphors here. Don't worry about the fact that it doesn't take extra work for God. And God said to him, to Moses, a man will come and be at the end of many generations. And Akiva ben Yosef is his name. Rabbi Akiva, for those of you who are on a first name basis. He will interpret from each and every tittle heaps of law. Tittle is the other word that's being used for these little tip decorations. And so Moses said to God, Master of the universe, show him to me. Allow me to see this great man who will interpret from these little lines, halakha, the interpretation of Torah as law. And God said to him, turn around. Right, which again is a sign that he's already there in the presence of Rabbi Akiva. This is heaven, you're in the presence of eternity, but let's move on. And so Moses went, and he sat at the back of the room. So he's now in the Beit Midrash. He's in the house of study that Rabbi Akiva is conducting. And Moses, you have to imagine, walks through the back door, and he sits at the back of the room. Now, sitting at the back of the room is a euphemism, because in the ancient academic setting, you would sit according to your ability, which meant if you were in the front seat right there by the teacher, you had been recognized by the teacher and the class as being the star pupil. And everyone else would be sitting ranked according to their ability further back in the room. I got the picture here? And yes, I know we're much more egalitarian now, and we let people sit wherever they like, and we don't make you take tests before you do. But at that time they did. And Moses sits where? At the back of the room, which means Moses is the least of the students in the room at the time. Moses. And he doesn't understand a word of what they're saying. So they're going on and on about all these legal things and law and all of that, and he is totally lost. And he became faint and frustrated, as anyone who's ever sat in a yeshiva for the first time would be. It's like, what in the world are they doing? And when Akiva came to one point, his student said to him, Teacher, how do you know this is so? And he replied, it is law given to Moses at Mount Sinai. This is, remember, something that Moses didn't really understand himself, but Akiva is claiming that it is from Moses at Mount Sinai. And Moses, rather than piping up at the back saying, well, you know, I was at Mount Sinai, and we didn't talk about this, instead he is comforted. Because he recognizes that what Akiva is doing is taking the law of Torah and applying it to his generation through the framework that is necessary to deal with the concerns, the issues, the troubles, the opportunities that his generation has. It doesn't mean that he is uprooting Torah. It doesn't mean that he is contradicting Torah, but he is going to be dealing with issues of property rights, of contract laws, of international affairs that Moses couldn't even begin to imagine, because Moses didn't live them. Which means that the application of Torah is a continual work, continual job. It is not something that we've analyzed all of Torah, we know what we're supposed to do, what do you want for lunch? It's for this topic, on this day, for this person, with this question, we came to a conclusion. We'll meet back out here tomorrow to do it again for the next. And again, and again, and again. And the circumstances may change slightly, and the law may then have to be applied very differently. Now, that doesn't mean the law is being uprooted. It means the law is fitting for the moment in which it is being demanded. How are we doing with that? I know it's a lot more work than going back to our picture of God saying, write this, and then that, and then this, and then just go read it, and everything's fine. This is a constant powerful emanation of God that is constantly having to be run through again and again and again if we want to make sense of it for our own life. So what happened? Why is reason really so important? Right? Because couldn't we just leave it to others? Well, there's an explanation that is offered by our sages of why reason is so critical. And this is a paraphrase. If you look in Avodat Kochavim, which is the section dealing with idolatry in Rambam's Mishnah Torah, his code of law, he begins with this explanation. And it's expanded there, so please do look up the whole version. And there are English translations online. He says, during the time of Enoch, which is one of the very, very early generations before the time of the flood, humanity made a great mistake. They said, you know, God created the stars and treated them with honor, right? He put them up in the sky. Doesn't that mean stars are pretty special? And if he did that, accordingly, it must be God's will that they honor those whom God had honored. Just like in an earthly court, right? If the king likes certain people, then I should probably show some respect to those people too. Because after all, if the king likes them, they must be worthy. And if God seems to think the stars are worthy, then I should probably show the stars a little respect too. Perfectly logical. Yes? Maybe, maybe not. No one bothered to point out the fallacies here, that just being in the sky doesn't mean they're actually being honored, any more than something that's in the ocean is being dishonored because it is somehow lower. And after many years of this sort of notion, false prophets came along and told people that God had commanded them to say, serve this star, or all the stars or whatever. Sacrifice to it, build a temple for it, make an image of it so that people could bow to it. And they would say, this image is the source of benefit or harm. And so it became appropriate to serve it or fear it. Right? All you need, once you begin to deviate from the notion of God and God alone, is someone to come along and say, oh, by the way, if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll have good luck. And if you don't do X, Y, and Z, you'll have bad luck. How many people, I don't need a show of hands, how many people will not walk under a ladder, not because it's a safety violation that OSHA prohibits, but because it's bad luck? How many people won't open up an umbrella inside their house? How many people will hang up a horseshoe or carry a four-leaf clover or a rabbit's foot? How many people are a little spooked if they spill some salt or if a black cat walks in front of them? How many people will bend over to pick up a penny, not because they don't want to just leave the money lying there, but because they think that maybe, it can't hurt, right? Without logic and reason to stop it, this is the direction we headed. And by we, I mean all of humanity. And these practices spread throughout the world, and eventually the name of God was forgotten by everyone. Because after all, if you're worried about the temples and the images of these stars because you want to get the benefit from it or you want to make sure they don't harm you, who's got time for God in all of that? Right? I've got a pantheon to pamper. I don't have time for the Creator. And so God became forgotten, and in their speech and thought, they no longer knew him. All were trained from childhood to bow down and serve idols. That is easy. If you don't have the constant application of true revelation with reason and proper analysis, human intelligence applied well, and subject to continual correction by public debate and discourse, rather than bowing to authority or bowing to miracles or bowing to some previous generation which didn't exist in order to understand our current day. If you take away any one of those parts, then you can end up with all sorts of silliness, or worse. Right? So what? What does it all mean? If you view God as picking and choosing, our first hyper-literal interpretation of when and who receives sacred knowledge, then billions and billions of people are left in the dark. And it is the most offensive statement ever made in the name of our Creator, that God only spoke to certain people throughout all of human history. How dare God hide himself from all of human history? What made Abraham so special? What made Moses so special that God decided to like them better? Decided to give us Torah, but not give anything to anyone else? God speaks continually to all of the universe, unstoppably. It's in God's nature to proclaim God's self through the fabric of reality. Only some have been able to achieve the personal level needed to properly understand, interpret, and share that with others, which we're going to come to in a minute. But that doesn't mean that God isn't broadcasting. Revelation, like creation, is an unstoppable outpouring of God's essence. Our difficulty in understanding God makes it hard to personally experience revelation with the clarity of Moses or the prophets. But, another very big but, we have a record of those revelations. As like I said before, I'll say it again, it's one of the greatest gifts we have is we are not starting from scratch. We're not Abraham, growing up in Ur Kasdim, wondering about life and having to dig and claw our way out of the rubbish heap of idolatry to finally experience the light of God. We've already been given the instruction book that has the clearest record of our understanding of God. We have the record of our understandings of what that revelation means, what we call Midrash and Mishnah and Talmud and Halakha and all of the Jewish application that has gone on for the last 2,500, 3,000 years. We have records of that, of what we think it means. And we each possess a rational mind that must engage with the revelations and with each other. All right? It's got to talk. You don't just sit with a stack of books and think you can read it and understand it on your own. So we may not be unearthing the raw material, thank God. We may not be digging the revelation ourselves, but every other step of the process, making God real in this world through our actions in harmony with revelation, needs us. To give you a comparison, you remember back from your Economics 101 class for the manufacturing cycle, right, you start off for a product with an idea, and then you get the raw materials and bits and pieces. Those go into manufacturing, then they get sent out until they finally arrive at retail use, right? This part, the concept, that's God. That God created the idea of all of reality. The materials, that's the raw nuts and bolts of revelation, the record we have in the Tanakh. Everything else, manufacturing, transportation, and use, we're still responsible for that. We have to put it together again and again and again. Every choice, every decision, every act we make, we are continually assembling from revelation and our understanding of it, the pieces needed to go out into the world to actually be used. And thou shalt not kill never saved anyone's life. The application of that commandment saves lives. When God tells people to leave a tithe for the poor, those words on the page don't feed a single person. Our understanding of those words and our use of those words to fuel our actions on behalf of those who are hungry feed millions. But we have to do that work. So no, we may not get the Moses revelation because we're not Moses. And that's not God's fault, and that's not ours fault, although we all could work a little harder. But we do have a very important role left to play. That God created the world is a blessing. That God made the world understandable by us is a blessing. The fact that our brains can figure out 2 + 2 = 4. The fact that force equals mass times acceleration, which is a very simple formula to remember. You're all at high school physics at least. Rather than some bizarre formula that keeps changing with no way for our minds to keep hold of it. That is a blessing. And that God gave us the ability to see truth revealed and reason to preserve it and use it is the ultimate blessing, because now we have a purpose rather than just capability. Torah is an expression of God's essence in its most fitting form for our people. It both flows from God and leads us towards God. We should think about and contemplate God's mitzvot, as Rambam says, and statements and actions until we attain an understanding of God and experience an ultimate pleasure in that attainment. The mitzvot and the words of our people help us recreate the experience of revelation, the re-experience the presence of God. Revelation that is applicable to all people is no longer taking place. But personal clarification and enlightenment within the boundaries of Torah continues and is essential. The Sanhedrin, the book of the Talmud known as Sanhedrin, says that since the death of the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, departed from Israel. Yet there was still a bat kol. There was still the daughter of a voice. There was still an echo of the sound of God. There was still a smidge of revelation, which means we're not looking for new raw material level revelation. That's been done. No one's going to write a better book than Moses wrote. But that doesn't mean that we don't still have the opportunity for a slightly different form of revelation. Meah Shiloach was a Hasidic master of the 1800s, and he wrote as follows: "If you walk in my statutes," taken from the book of Numbers. If, he says, is the language of doubt. For who knows if one manages to keep the Torah according to the depth of the will of God? More about the will of God next week. There is depth in the words of Torah to a greater degree than what is written in the externals. God enlightened our sages concerning this commandment with insight into the depth of the will of God. That is why the language of doubt is used here in this section of Torah. That even if a person is careful to keep the entire Shulchan Aruch, the definitive law code for at least this time period, the ultimate culmination of how to apply Jewish law practically, even if you do everything right that's in that book, follow every single stricture that is there, it is still doubtful whether he has focused on the depth of God's will, may he be blessed. For the will of God is very deep. Who can discover? The language of if is also the language of prayer. That God, if it is possible to say, prays that it should only be that you will walk in my statutes and focus on the depth of my will. And so all of this analysis and debate and discussion and logic, may I actually also say, leads us to Shulchan Aruch, leads us to the concrete application of Jewish law, which is great. But for each one of us, we also have a call from God for our own particular mission, our own particular way of walking in this world according to God's will. And that you don't just find in a book and debate and discussion. That is not only an analytical process. If we allow ourselves to marvel and wonder at the world, Torah, and God, if we recognize that awe is a spiritual act, then we can be open to God's revealed presence and direction. There are no fiery fingers pointing the way, but with study, discussion, prayer, and the mitzvot, the path becomes clearer. Each one of us does have the capacity to experience some measure of revelation for ourselves. No one here should think they're going to be the next Moses. The Torah is very clear, no prophet, no matter when, is ever going to come that will uproot Torah, that will change Torah, that will add to Torah. We've got the right copy of what we need as a people and what the world needs. But me individually, I still need a little more. Me individually, I need to know how to walk in this way. And I'm not going to say that my own experience of that revelation is going to be good for anyone else, that I'm going to be able to translate it universally, that everyone has to follow what I've decided God has told me. But I do have to look for my own unique connection to God. Within the bounds of Torah, right? I don't get to go out and say, God has decided that I get to go kill people. I don't just say God has told me that it's okay for me to cheat people. That God has decided, as we have had people in the Jewish past, that it's okay for me to have adultery. I don't get to do that, no matter how much I may think God has spoken to me in those words. And that's where Torah becomes a bedrock that you can't dig through. And that's where we begin to recognize why having a clear and calm and non-impassioned mind is so important for the gift of prophecy. But barring that, I can hope that with study, with discussion, with prayer, and through the observance of mitzvot, I will come closer and closer to experiencing God, which is what revelation is the experience of God. We just call the revelation because it is a record of that greatest experience that's ever happened. But all of us have that same calling. We may not have as big of a radio set. Right? We may not be able to tune it in as well as Moses did, or any of the other prophets did. But don't be upset when you hear static. At least it means something's working. At least it means you can begin fine-tuning. And maybe you can ask someone else and figure out between you, or among you, or with all of you, how to fix a radio. As I promise, God is still broadcasting. All right, 10 minutes over for the official time, but questions are always welcome. What are angels? So we're going to talk a little bit more about angels next week, but I'll give you the shorthand version. Angels are pure, immaterial expressions of God's will. Right? They are without choice. They are without will. Angels are an emanation of God's will, but they have no body. Whereas we, on the other hand, are corporeal and impure expressions of God's will, as you may say, because it's up to our decisions of whether we will reflect God's will or not. So angels act, in a sense, as these disembodied waves of God impacting into the world. But we're going to talk a lot more about God as an actor in the world in our final session next week.
CH instead of SH?
I believe it was the SH, I know, and Enosh. There's a lot of guys back there with very similar names, don't worry.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
Okay. I'm surprised no one's asked me the big question, which is, did Moses really write this?
Say that again?
Did Moses really write this?
Yep, I was wondering that.
You were wondering that,
Why
okay.
does he, if he wrote, entire Torah, not so much,
The first 5 books, yeah.
why does he talk, why would he say, when I was born, but I thought that.
Yeah, well, you and your awkward mind are most welcome. So, and this is why I didn't put it into the official formal discussion, because for some people this is a burning question, because they feel that the description of the Torah as being written by one guy doesn't jive with the archaeological and the literary analysis of modern scholarship. For other people, the account as the Torah, well, the account as our tradition has interpreted the Torah as making, since the Torah itself doesn't really describe itself as being the sole product of Moses, but the tradition certainly has, is perfectly fine with them, and they're not interested in another alternative interpretation. And that's going to be the short answer, which is ultimately, it doesn't actually matter. And I know that that's so unsatisfying because people have spent the last 200 years fighting and throwing rocks at each other over this question of who wrote the Bible. If you said it wasn't Moses, then you're damned. If you said it was Moses, then you're stupid. And ultimately, all the Torah asks us to accept is that it is a perfect reflection for our people of our encounter with God. How that reflection came to exist in our world could be according to the most literal interpretation of our traditional understanding, which, by the way, there are multiple understandings within our tradition, but let's even take the most literal of our tradition, which says that it was Moses on a mountain with a pen and a lot of ink and wrote it down word for word. And that's fine. We have a perfect representation. On the other hand, you can have, and this is going to sort of drift into next week's discussion, an understanding that says, no, the Torah was written over 500 years by multiple authors in different communities within the Israelite conglomerate of culture, and then it was compiled and edited and redacted and drafted and changed again over the course of a few hundred years. And I say, so what? You believe a God that can create the fundamental laws of the universe can't arrange for a little creative editing? Can't ensure that the right person put together the right sentence at the right time over 500 years? That God was only able to make the Torah work if he had one guy in a mountain for 40 days? But if he had to work with a committee, God would never have gotten the Torah out? Depends on the committee, maybe, but...
See, this got bad. This really got bad. I'm gonna tell you why. If it's true that it is changed and edited, and then one, you don't have to change anything. And two, then you have problems like there is now. Christianity and Islam and the changing of Torah.
Which is why the point that we are left on between these two extremes, and there is an entire spectrum of analysis and interpretation between them. It's not binary as the way people try to make it sound. There are people who bring those two closer to a balance in the middle or lean one way or the other, but ultimately it is unimportant if we are willing to accept that the Torah we have, as I said way back near the beginning, is the Torah that God wants us to have. And the means by which it was transcribed to us is much less important. Understanding that the Torah is perfect because it is a perfect emanation, revelation from God, even if that emanation took place through a non-traditional means, in a way that doesn't lend itself very easily to caricature, doesn't strip away the perfection of the text. If you have studied the Torah in depth, if you have given over some amount of time to really trying to probe passages and explanations and interpretations, you begin to come away with an understanding of Torah that this is a very, very special document. That it is not the same as reading Shakespeare. It is not the same as reading Mark Twain or some other great author. But there is something happening here that has an implication both personally, spiritually, communally, globally, and eternally that unfolds as you pull open the letters, as you peel back one layer after another. But there is something that transpires in this experience, this encounter, this revelation that doesn't happen with other texts. And once you are convinced of that, once you have felt that, it really doesn't matter how that book came to be in your possession. I know from those standing on the outside of that experience, it seems like the most important thing ever. Because if I don't know who the author was, how do I know I should trust it? And all I can say is, for those of you that love Shakespeare, does it matter whether William Shakespeare wrote those plays or not? Would you not go to Hamlet if it didn't say Shakespeare on the playbill? Or would you say Hamlet is a beautiful, masterful work of English literature? And I don't care whether it was William Shakespeare, or whether it was Francis Bacon, or whether it was some guy in the back room, or a committee somewhere in the middle of London. The play is the thing. That's Hamlet, yeah. The play is the thing that catches the punch except the king. Right, the play is the thing. Would a rose by any other name not smell as sweet? Right? The bugaboo of authorship became an important consideration during the time of the Greek incursions. When the Greeks came into our lands and took over from the Persians, who had been in charge up to that point, the big Greek thing was, who is the author of your books? Because if it's a good author, then we'll give you respect for your books. If it's a bad author, we won't. That's where authority comes from from the author, not from the wisdom of the book itself, not from the wisdom of the laws. The authority comes from the author. And what did Judaism say? Well, we said, well, they know Moses, because Moses had been made famous by Herodotus and by other ancient scholars. So yeah, when they asked us who wrote the Bible, we'll say Moses. We're done. Now let us get back to actually living the Torah. Let us get back to studying the Torah. Because ultimately, who wrote the Bible? God. Who put pen to paper is a very interesting academic discussion. Who was the author is God. Who here has heard of Stephen Hawking? Right? Is Stephen Hawking an author? Has he written any books? How? He's a paraplegic. He can't write anything. He can't type. He can't hold a pen. Oh, you mean someone else wrote down what he dictated? You mean someone else took his words and put them into a book for the rest of us to read and be confused? Because he's much more brilliant in astrophysics than any of us? Does that mean that the person who wrote down his book is the author, or does that mean he's the author because the ideas and the words are his? Or are we going to sit and argue for 200 years about whether Stephen Hawking really wrote A Brief History of Time? No, we're going to say he wrote it, even though someone else published it. Someone else actually did the writing. The question is uninteresting of whether he wrote it or he didn't write it, because we understand that he did. Through whatever means it happened, whatever vehicle, whatever form, whatever technology was used to get the idea from his mind to our book. If you're in publishing, I'm sure that might be an interesting topic. But for the rest of us, we don't care about the in-between. And ultimately, when it comes to Revelation, it's going back to this notion that what we have is the record we need to have. If we use it, if we fight with it, if we struggle with it, if we analyze it. One last little thing. It's not as though Judaism has never asked the questions about who wrote which different parts of the Bible. All of the incongruities that the academics will throw in the direction of Torah and say, well, this must have been from this source and that from this source, all of them have been identified and interpreted 2,000 years ago. And they said, well, you know, some of the sources seem to be written with the Yud-He Vav-He name, the name we discussed in great detail last week, and some seem to be written with the name Elohim. So there must have been one group who really liked the Yud-He Vav-He name, and one group that really liked the Elohim name, and then eventually someone took the text and shuffled them and stapled them together. We said, no. 2,000 years ago, we noticed that some passages are with one name and some with the others, and we said those that represent Yud-He, are represented by Yud-He Vav-He, represent God in its purest and most essential and compassionate form, and those that are written in the other form of Elohim represent God in a manner that we will relate to as more just, strict justice, which, by the way, is not something we always want. That's why, again, to refer back to last week, the Yud-He Vav-He trumps all other names. It's why we finished the Aleinu with the prophecy of Zechariah. At the end of days, God's name will be one. Right? Shemo Echad. God's name will be one. Which name will that one name be? It'll be the Yud-He Vav-He name, because we'll not need to know God through any other intermediary name. We will know God purely and clearly through that one name. And so we took what they call incongruities and we said, no, we're supposed to learn from this. We're not supposed to get out the scissors and cut along the lines. We're supposed to see how this sits together on the page. And so too for all of the incongruities that they point to as being evidence of some divisions. So I'm not a big fan of the documentary hypothesis. I think it's been very overblown. I think there are certain parts of our tradition that allow for a more nuanced interpretation rather than the hyper-literal Moses on the top of the mountain for 40 days writing things down. But ultimately, I think you can comfortably sit with an understanding of Revelation, as we discussed today, as being a capturing of God's essence into words so that the rest of us can experience and grow through it to have our own experience of God without doing the hard work from ground zero. And we can leave the discussion of who wrote which word in which century to those who get paid for it in universities. And God bless them for the work they do. They come to some very interesting conclusions.
You explain the word revealed presence. Are we talking about the revealed presence of the people of Israel or individual
Individual human beings in this sentence. I'm saying that each and every one of us has the capacity, whether it be clear or unclear, whether it be powerful or whether it be faint, to experience God directly. Do not expect to be Moses, right? Don't expect it, but we've all been given the radio set, right? We've all got the equipment necessary to connect to God. Most of us are going to get very, very faint signals because we just have not developed ourselves to the ability where we can hear clearly and loudly. And oftentimes we will begin to tune in and we will feel overwhelmed. Think of that moment of awe. Right? Awe is supposed to be one of the ways we begin to experience God's presence. We begin to tap into this revelation. And yet many of us recoil from awe. We almost dampen it down. People will say, oh, sorry, I got choked up there. Don't be sorry. If you got choked up at the birth of a child, you should recognize it's not just because you're happy the kid was born happy, healthy and safe, but because you are recognizing in that moment one of the great miracles of God. That God is revealing one of the great mysteries of how the universe was created at this moment when life comes into being, its own unique essence, now independent and free in this world. Of course you should be overcome. Don't step back. Don't be afraid from that experience. If you go to the Grand Canyon, you go right up to the edge. You don't stand in the parking lot and say, I can see it from here. And when you go up to the edge, don't just say it's a big hole. Marvel at it. Wonder at its construction, at the millions of years required. See history unfolding in the layers of the rocks and the colors on the wall. Recognize that you have a capacity to sense beauty. Where did that come from? God is screaming at us from every corner of the world. And we so often either don't bother to plug in or tune in, or when we do, we get uncomfortable with the emotions and the experience, and so we step back. And that's a shame, because you don't have to. And it doesn't mean you're going to be some crazy person who thinks God is always talking to them. It doesn't mean you're going to be some lunatic locked up in the asylum because you hear voices. We're not talking about fiery fingers and voices from heaven that are speaking clearly to you. Remember, the prophets could barely see God, and none of us are prophets. The best we can hope for is a reflection of a hint of an echo. But when you're reflecting infinity, that's still pretty amazing. But you have to let yourself. All right, I think the screensaver is telling me something here. So we're going to finish for today. Again, next week we are going to be talking about God as an actor in the world. This will be the most controversial and difficult subject of our entire three-part section. We'll see how it goes.